Uh, welcome to this video. The idea for this video has been with me for quite a while. It's been focused on really understanding how our internal system, our protectors, defenses, the reactions we have in our life are based around old childhood pain, and how a lot of what we do in the world and why it's so difficult to change can actually be understood if we understand that most of what we do in our life is built to avoid pain we faced in the past, and that thus changing will include looking at that pain or finding a new way of being with it. Now, I want to dive into that with a lot more depth today and really give you a model of how to understand this, and I want to focus on three main questions in that today. Now, the questions are: how unprocessed or overwhelming emotions from childhood can be triggered. That was not how I meant to be it. This is the first time that I'm doing this on my iPad, so there will probably be a few bloopers, but bear with me. So how unprocessed and overwhelming emotions from childhood can be triggered. How does that actually work? What does that even mean? Now, besides that, how are most of our patterns and defenses built to avoid these emotions? Because that would be my underlying assumption for today, that most of what we do is actually built to avoid pain from the past, even though it may not be really realistic that that pain can and would still arise today. But it's still built around that. And number three is what it takes to change these patterns and defenses long term. So what we need to do to get there. And I'm going to explain all of this in a parts model. So looking at our psyche as having different parts, and that they are interacting with each other, and that it's really about which part in us is active, which isn't. Now, to do this today, I want to give you an example. I want to give you the basics of parts psychology. I want to talk about the genius of our protectors, how actually the things that are now creating problems in our life are a genius way of dealing with struggles in our life. And then I want to talk about why change is possible now. That's going to be the video today. To start this all off, I want to give to start this whole video off, I want to give a small example of what I mean by unprocessed or overwhelming childhood emotions. Now, imagine this situation of a boy being in school. And it doesn't even have to be a huge situation, but imagine this boy, in this example exemplified by this little lion cub. And he's in school, he's called to the board. He has to do some maths, and he does it wrong. And imagine in this example, for instance, he has to solve 1 + 1, and he comes out with 4. And then the teacher says something mean, and the class laughs about him. And what happens for this boy is that he feels shame. He feels a shame, and even as he sits down on his chair, he feels shame. And this shame is very big for him. He feels bad, he feels stupid, he feels ugh. And that's kind of the start of a negative, intense childhood emotion. Now, what's important to understand that this situation is not the same as the burden, meaning something we might carry into our life later on, based on this situation. The situation itself is not the burden that we can later have in our life, the thing that really creates problems for us. Why is it not the same? That's actually pretty simple, because there is always a possibility of us, or of this little lion cub, feeling the shame, it being overwhelming in the moment, but actually long term, the lion cub being able to digest, process this feeling, and it not staying with him as a burden, as something that he carries with him through his life. There is that possibility. So the key thing to understand is that the pain of our childhood that is still creating problems in our life later is the parts of us, are the burdens of us we couldn't process. Now, going into this as an example, we have this overwhelming situation. In this case, the lion cub who feels shame in this class situation. And if we imagine that this little boy or lion cub goes home, and at home he has parents, maybe a godmother, some situation in which he can process and digest what happened to him at school. So that's, hey, how was it at school? Oh, I'm stupid. I don't know math. Oh, it's so bad. And this shame that's still active in the system can come out. And in this loving, holding environment, this lion cub can actually let go of it. So through the support of somebody else, he can let it go, and there will be no burden. So this boy or this lion cub may still not be totally joyful the next time he walks up to the blackboard, but he's like, okay, I can do it. There is a sense of being able to do it. Now, contrast that with the other situation. Imagine this boy goes home and he's alone. There's nobody there, there's nobody who cares, there's nobody who asks him, how was your day? There's nobody who offers him emotional space. So it's very difficult to have further processing. Now, not even difficult to have further processing, it's much more probable that this shame will just spiral because there is nobody there who supports him to understand that maybe that comment the teacher made wasn't meant that bad. Yes, maybe the children laughed, but maybe they didn't laugh at him. And even if he did something wrong, he still has the chance to improve at maths. But if there's nobody there to do that with him, what often stays from these situations are burdens. Burdens meaning unprocessed emotions that are stuck in the system, in the terminology of the internal family system, that are there as a burden and as an exile, a part of us carrying that emotion. So this is the next picture. It's a part that then carries the shame. It has intensified in the boy, in the lion cub, and it's then something that is stored in the system and that stays in the system long term. Now, to dive a little bit deeper, I want to give you the very simple overview of a parts model of our psyche. How does our mind, how does our personality work if we look at it as having different parts? Now, the very first tenet of this model is quite straightforward, is we all have many parts. All of us. Every single person, we have different parts, parts that feel different, parts that do different things. We all have many parts. Most of these parts are actually healthy. Healthy meaning they have a role in our life and they're helping us to live a good, healthy, successful, happy life. And some of our parts are extreme. They are extreme in the sense that they are mostly built around childhood experiences we couldn't fully digest. So they are still in extreme roles and extreme behaviors because they think they need to protect us from those dangerous situations that could happen again at any moment. Now, not all of our parts are always active. You can even look at it as most of our parts are not active most of the time, and only some of our parts are active, meaning actively creating our behavior, our feelings, our perception of the world right now. So the parts that are not active could be described as being in a repository. This part is there, this part is there. They're all potentially active, they could become active, and only a few of them actually are active right now. And what happens in a certain situation, this is a situation where somebody is interacting with a group of people, parts that can deal with this situation or that believe, or that in this case, a part that believes it needs to come up will become active. So if we had a day where we were just all by ourselves the whole day, and then suddenly we have to meet a big group of people, a different part will come up. A part that can deal with that group of people. Maybe it's a part that's very able of socially interacting, or a different part, maybe one that thinks it's more important to hide, will come up to deal with this situation. So depending on the situation, a different part will be activated. Let's refer back to the example we had about the little boy or the little cub that couldn't digest, couldn't deal with the situation he had experienced in the classroom. Let's just imagine that shame really stays in him as a part, as a burden, and that different situations that are similar to the situation in the classroom can trigger that, can bring it up from the repository into active. Now, in this example, let's imagine that this cub is there at a sports meeting, and there's a group of people, and actually they're his companions at a sports meeting, and he has to interact with them. But because this situation is so similar to the classroom situation, it's so similar to what happened when he went to the blackboard, when he had to do maths, what actually happens is that in him, the shame that wasn't processed comes up, it comes active, and he just feels ashamed. He feels bad, he feels, oh, I'm not good enough, all of that starting because this undigested part of his experience comes up, is triggered, is activated right now. The important thing to really get is he feels the shame right now. He feels the shame right there with the people in the sports meeting. He feels ashamed in that moment. But the shame is not a realistic reaction to the situation. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by the shame is not a realistic reaction to the situation? What I mean by that is that the shame he's feeling is not actually related to these people in this moment. It's not related to having to talk to them. It is related to what happened in front of a group in the past that is still affecting him. So the fact that this shame comes up and he interacts with the situation through that shame right now, which is totally understandable, we all do that, is not realistic in the sense that he would probably not need that shame. There is nobody making fun of him. And is he good enough? Very probably, yes. But because that shame is still stuck in his system, it is what's coming up. So we can look at this through this drawing of the shame that he feels at the sports event is a trigger of his past undigested shame. It is what's coming up from the repository into the active. The shame he feels is the reactivation, the trigger from the past. And this is the point where I want to step beyond just this adverse experience, trigger, how this affects life, because this is actually where the genius of our path system, of our psychological system comes in. This is the genius of our path system. This is what happens. And let me explain this drawing. So in the example we had, until now there was only shame. So any situation in which this boy is in a similar situation to the classroom situation, so sports events, etc., this shame will come active. Now, what happens in our parts system is that we will start to develop parts, or parts will take on roles that actually protect this shame. So these parts will take on certain behaviors, certain patterns. They will learn what they can do so that two things happen. Number one, a situation that would have triggered the shame before doesn't do that anymore. They're protecting the shame from the outside world. And that ways in which the shame would have just come active don't happen anymore either, so that the boy doesn't constantly feel ashamed anymore. And our parts system will develop strategies for that. These parts will take on roles and strategies for that actually fit our life situation. That's why every person finds different ways of dealing with similar situations. Some are more fitting, some are more challenging, but we all find our own ways. And often, if you understand them in the context of when they were developed, they are genius situations to trying to find a way for these painful, undigested emotions from the past to not come up anymore. And usually later on in life they also create problems. But the genius of it, I think, is incredible, to look at our system as adjusting to what's needed and how to avoid these painful emotions coming up again and again. So basically these new parts, or parts that have taken on a role, they protect the shame from being triggered from the outside. That's what I drew as this chip. They make sure that things that would have usually hit this shame don't hit it anymore. Or that our system is constantly overwhelmed through the shame becoming active. That's their job. That's what they do. Now, to give you an example of how this could look is that rather than me getting into situations where I am ashamed, I will just be disinterested. No, I don't really care. No, that's not important to me. Through that, I actually don't have the same hit of, oh, I'm not good enough. Because if I don't care, then meh. I don't care if I'm not good enough. It may not be the best way to live our life, but it's a pretty brilliant strategy to not land here again and again and again and again. Similar, it could be that if a shame, I am not good enough, comes up, we could turn that, and rather than shame coming up, we could actually get into pride or even arrogance of, I'm not good enough, I am actually incredible. These people just don't realize how absolutely great I am. Where earlier the shame would have been what comes up, and now it's not the shame anymore, but it's pride, arrogance. So it's how our internal system learns dealing with that shame. Now, we've developed these protectors. We've developed new strategies to deal with situations where usually the shame would have been triggered. And here's what usually happens then. In the beginning, all that is there is the shame. So in all these situations, the shame gets activated again. And then we develop protectors. These protectors usually start learning and dealing with situations incredibly quickly. So where we would have been triggered in shame again and again and again and again, it's more and more the disinterest or the pridefulness that takes over, and we don't actually feel the shame nearly as much anymore. There will still be times when it kind of comes through, but it's much rarer, and in many cases we may even forget that it's there. Whereas on the other hand, the disinterestedness, the pridefulness will be very active a lot of the time. We're aware of it. This is who we are, or who we think we are. So from one perspective, what happens in this is we get better and better and better, which means more automatic at protecting, defending. That means these parts are becoming more automatic. It's more automatic that these parts come up and that they make sure nothing comes through and this part doesn't get activated. In one way, what this means is that we had this idea of the repository and parts that are active. And we can look at the shame as kind of dropping out of the repository. The shame is less and less present in our life. The shame is less and less able to even come online. And this is why IFS calls these old emotions that are kind of kept at bay exiles. They're exiled from the rest of the system. They're not being activated. And they're not part of us as much anymore. So they kind of drop out of the repository. But, and this is really important, these still do their job because they protect us from the old childhood pain. The parts, the protectors are still there because they are scared we might be overwhelmed, because they're worried we might get flooded with this shame if they didn't do what they do anymore. This is so important to understand, and I think it can't be overstated that these strategies are working because they're afraid that if they didn't, we would just be as overwhelmed as we were in childhood again. And this is where we have to get to a reality check. We have to get to a reality check of why were things so overwhelming for us in childhood, and are they still now? And at one core, this comes down to a fundamental distinction about what are the resources and capacities that a child has available to them, and how are they now in an adult. Now, the reality of the situation is, as children, there are many things that would be needed for digesting and dealing with negative or painful or overwhelming experiences that aren't as developed. Our mental representations and perspectives on difficult situations, on ourselves, are very limited. We just don't have much cognitive overlay yet. The capacities of ourself, even though in one way very immediately there, and by self I mean kind of our true nature, it's a technical term in internal family system, immediately there, children are incredibly present. The self hasn't yet fully learned how to take care of parts, because how could it? Capacities for self-regulation are still developing. You see this in children, I would say in teenagers all the time, that self-regulation is not the easiest thing to do. And we don't really have life experiences yet to put into perspective what's happening. How bad is it that these people laughed? Or how bad may it not be based on my other life experiences? Now, all of this, mental representations, capacities of ourself, self-regulation, life experiences, we have a whole lot more when we're adults. A whole lot more of these. So, children and adults are in very different situations when it comes to dealing with painful situations. So the reality is, what happened was too much for the child. And it was too much for the developing system. Mentally we couldn't deal with it. Our self didn't yet have the capacities to deal with it. Our self-regulation was incredibly limited, and our life experiences didn't help us to actually be able to contextualize what's happening. It was too much. The shame, the situation was overwhelming. That is the reality. The other reality is, it is not for us anymore. We have all of this. We have so much more as a base. We have so many more resources. So what was overwhelming back then isn't anymore. This even comes down to how big that part is in us now, where it stretches the whole body in the child. In us as adults, we can still contain it in our body. And the fact that we now have these different resources, that we now have new capacities, is a massive chance for healing and transformation. As adults, with ourselves, with our mind, with our life experiences, we can actually go inside and we can meet these parts. We can get to know our defenses. We can connect with our protectors, and we can meet and heal our old pain. We have these capacities now. We have these resources now to actually do that, because we had the chance of developing our whole system so that what was once overwhelming isn't for us anymore. In a way, we could say that we now have the mental capacities. We now have the self capacities, the regulatory capacities, the life experiences to actually deal with the childhood pain that's still there in us and actually help it heal in a sustainable way. Now, there are many approaches on how to heal, how to transform, what we can do to support that, what kind of help we can get from others. And because there are many approaches, one of the things I just want to say is find what works for you and find what works for your problem. I don't think there is one correct approach. I don't think there is one way of being with us that will lead to transformation and everything else is bullshit. I just think that's untrue. So please find what works for you and your problem. Now, obviously I have my own thoughts on this, and I have my own kind of ways of dealing with these challenges, and I just want to give you a rough overview. I've gone into much more detail into this at other places of how I personally think it's powerful to look at this and to work with this. Now, the first thing I really want to point to is that I think our patterns as far as protection and the old pain or the undigested challenges that we are still carrying are really two different layers. This is what is much easier to meet. I think many people are much more aware of their patterns and of the parts and patterns that are creating problems in their life, and very few people are actually aware of the underlying psychological or emotional pain. So I think that's a really important distinction, that we're usually first working with the protectors and patterns, and often the underlying pain that these patterns think they need to protect us from are not necessarily readily available. So for me, at least in one perspective, I think it often comes down to 3 core steps. Step number 1 is for us to connect with our protectors in a new way. Connect with them not in a way of, I want to get rid of you, but connect with them openly and in a way lovingly. You know, that's obviously a difficult word, because what does that mean? But to be open, to be appreciative, to be empathetic towards our protectors. Then, when we have connected with them, what I find is that they often allow us to actually meet the deeper pain. We then don't have to go looking for it. We don't have to dig up the garden. But they show us what the underlying pain is. And what we can then do is help release this pain. This often has to do with becoming aware of ourself. For me, this means that we're becoming aware that we are not this little cub anymore, but we're adults. We have all of these different resources. And we actually have this core to us that is open, that is calm, that is loving, that is our self. So in this drawing, it's the self I want to emphasize. And through that we can suddenly actually contain and hold this pain in a completely new way. Now, it's also about realizing that the past is past. That what these difficult situations were in the past, they were difficult, but we're not in them anymore. Many of our parts believe we're still stuck in these situations, that we're basically still at school being scolded, rather than adults that have completely different resources and that can deal with situations differently. So through becoming aware of the self, realizing that the past is past, and actually letting go of the emotional burden that these parts have carried for so long, we can find new spaces and new kind of energies or essences of who we are in us that can then guide us in our life again. And based on that, we can then renegotiate with the protectors. We can get to them seeing, wow, there is more than I was aware of before. There is this weird self thing. And we can renegotiate with them how they come active in our life, how strongly they have to come active, what they have to do. If I'm actually this lion, do I have to react the same as this lion cub? No. I kind of have different possibilities, and there are quite a few more animals or people scared of me than this. So through releasing the old pain and our protectors also becoming aware that they don't need to protect this anymore, we can renegotiate how they enter our life, what they do, and we can actually find new ways of them maybe still fulfilling their role, but doing it in a much more healthy and a much more easy way. And also finding ways in which the self, us as adults, as beings, can be more in charge of our life. This is a really, really broken down version of this. I've gone into a lot more detail. I will probably go into a lot more detail because I fucking enjoy this drawing. But that's the core of how I look at it. I hope today's video kind of gave you a taste of what it means for emotions to not be digested, to not be processed, what it means for them to stay stuck in the system, and what impact that actually has on our whole emotional internal system. I hope you kind of got a feeling for the actually genius of protectors then taking on roles that lead to this old pain just not constantly coming up in us, but us finding new ways of dealing with challenges that that actually doesn't involve us feeling ashamed all the time. And I also hope you kind of get a feel for why it might be so important to release these old emotions or to heal these parts, so that through that our whole system can kind of fundamentally reorient and reorganize itself. And through that we can find a much deeper and much more grounded way of being in the world in a way that is not based on this fear of the old childhood experience, but that is based on an understanding of who we actually are and what the actual fucking powers are that we have. Because we aren't that anymore. We're often much closer to this, which allows very different ways of living our life. So that was it for today. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you soon. You never know what's around the